Okay, welcome, and it's great to see you again. So many of you actually. You know that. You know what this is. This is A. It's a shorthand of Agora for interdisciplinary debate, and I anticipate we are going to have some nice debate today. But aid also suggests aid, help. And the idea is that these people are supposed to help one another, and the rest of us are supposed to help them to help each other, including themselves, of course. We all know that economics is a very contested discipline, and it has been so almost as long as it has existed. As long as there has been economics, it has been challenged, criticized in various ways, more or less heavily. Regarding the extensions of this critique and these challenges, sometimes it's just a matter of criticizing a particular theory or model or something like that. That's fairly innocent and harmless. But at the other end of the spectrum of criticisms, the whole fundamentals, even the legitimacy of the whole discipline have been questioned and challenged. And each time we witness these criticisms and challenges and debates, it's somewhere in between these two extremes. Also, the intensity of these debates and criticisms have varied greatly. From, I'm thinking of the intensity of the beliefs and convictions and emotions that are present in this debate. Sometimes it's emotionless. Sometimes there are very heated emotions involved, and we'll just see how this debate today will relate to these past examples of this. The history of these debates is long around economics, but now that we had this nice crisis in the economy itself, it's all, again, very topical and hot. It's on the agenda, and today we are going to have one of those many debates that have been going on in the recent years, and in the coming years I would expect also. We have Heikki Patomäki from political science challenging, as I understand, I anticipate, economics and its legitimacy or whatever, and Hannu Vartiainen, economics professor, I anticipate will be defending the case of economics, but we'll see what happens, and we'll do our best to help you help yourself.
I have only something like 20 minutes, and I have almost 20 slides, so I have only about 1 minute for each slide, just in case I actually printed out copies of my presentation. Unfortunately, there are only 40 of them, so not enough for everyone. But that should help you to read those parts that I can't tackle in any detail. Now, the original title of this session was had this word autism in it, and this relates to the movement that was started in France some 12 years ago, when a group of economic students published a petition on the web protesting against these 4 features: lack of realism in economics, particularly in economics teaching, but also involving research as well, the uncontrolled use and treatment of mathematics, and particularly certain strands of mathematics, the repressive domination of neoclassical theory against all kinds of possible alternatives. There's a wide variety of them, but only one of them is being taught in most universities in France and many other countries, including in Finland as well. And the dogmatic teaching style in economics, which doesn't encourage any sort of pluralistic debate about the basis of the discipline, but just gives the impression that the bases are as certain as in the basic college level mathematics or physics or something like that. This led, some 10 years later, to the founding of the World Economics Association, that already is the biggest, by far the biggest professional association in economics that has ever existed. There are already over 10,000 economists and related scholars, including myself, who have joined this. I consider myself, in many of my roles, but not in all of my roles, as a political economist. So I start by arguing that these campaigns are in fact well justified. And the point of this presentation is to uncover what I call the practical premise of action and habit, making these outcomes possible. And I also claim that the basic principles are in a way written at the level of methodology. And this is the level where most economists are not willing to have any sort of dialogue. They simply take it for granted. And largely what they take for granted is the positivist or logical positivist philosophy of science, which is not particularly popular in social sciences anymore or in philosophy, but for economists, most mainstream economists, it's a taken for granted background for everything that they do. Of course, some of them and some methodologically oriented scholars like Bloch have been advocating falsificationism. Karl Popper's falsificationism was of course critical of the old style logical positivism, but that's the continuum of the debate in economics methodology, from logical positivism to Popperian falsification, that from a critical theoretical point of view appears as another strand of positivism. Although in my view there were other aspects to Karl Popper's philosophy that were much more interesting and pluralistic. And there are of course some who also stress the requirement that one's assumptions must be realistic, and we will see that there are also alternative substantial approaches to economics that basically share the methodological underpinnings. But very often they also claim that it's not enough to have kind of an instrumentalist stand on the assumptions, but we have to claim some realism to them as well. Another thing is that there are major theory-practice inconsistencies in the methodology and methods of economics. Very often there's at least, at one level, there's a claim that these are testable and falsifiable claims, but very few economists in fact test or falsify anything. The majority of economics journals articles are just mathematical representations of certain things. They don't test anything. And even the rest of them, those who actually use econometrics or other testing methods, usually try to verify the null hypothesis rather than falsify anything, not to speak of the more fundamental levels of theory. There are all kinds of complications to the claim that I make. I present them in the form of 10 theses. The basic argument is the one coming from Wittgenstein. All testing of a hypothesis takes place already within a system. And this system is not so much the point of departure as the element in which arguments have their life. So even when we are talking about more sophisticated and technical economic research, they take this background, the whole edifice of the fundamental assumptions mostly for granted. They can question or problematize one small assumption in time and then taking the rest as something that is certain, or that's something that can be taken as self-evident. And you can do that basically for any particular assumption, small assumption. But it doesn't make the system any different. And what I'm interested here is the system as a whole, not any particular small assumption. This is the first thesis. Positivist methodology generates theory-practice inconsistencies. It includes a particular ontology and epistemology, empiricism, most famously associated with David Hume and his kind, is not only an epistemological doctrine, in fact it's also an ontological doctrine, basically implying that the only thing that there really is our sense perceptions of the reality. So there's a conflation of ontology and epistemology, which is the starting point. One of the effects is to make these perceptions appear certain rather than something that we interpret on the basis of our conceptual frameworks. But there's an element or component of rationalism as well. This is the deductivist part. So by using deductive logical mathematics, you can draw certain consequences from certain assumptions that are taken as either self-evident or evident on the basis of evidence. And then the claim is that you can draw some conclusions that somehow are less self-evident than the assumptions. But in principle, in deductive logical mathematics, nothing much is added in making all those inferences. All the information lies already in the assumptions themselves. The second part of positivism includes the requirement of operationalization. Concept must be operationalized in terms of the empirical content. The third is the hypothetical deductive model of explanation that requires that we have actually laws in society. So the explanation is basically about subsuming a particular instance under a more general law. This is the Hempel-Oppenheim model of explanation, mostly not accepted in most social sciences anymore. They used to be very popular in the 1950s and 1960s, but by the early 2000s, I mean, hardly any social scientist is anymore following this model of explanation in the actual research. And the fourth thesis is that there's supposed to be a symmetry between explanation and prediction. If you have a law and you know the conditions, if you can explain the past in that way, you can also predict the future in the same way as well. If you know the conditions now, you know what will follow in the future. So there is a symmetry of explanation and prediction. The contradictions arise from these. The first two exclude, for instance, conceptual work, and yet all economic theories, even within the neoclassical framework, necessarily involve also conceptual work. So that's one practical inconsistency. The second is that we know from experience, we've been trying to do this for more than 100 years in social sciences, including in economics, that there are hardly any empirical invariances. They tend to be local, they tend to be contextual, they tend to be temporal, and then they are contrastive. So they can change, and they do change. And this applies also to the basic so-called laws of supply and demand, as I will claim shortly. And also, finally, as far as the symmetry thesis is concerned, economics can in fact predict nothing. The complicated and sophisticated econometric models that many research institutes and so on and so forth use in forecasting the future can only predict something like for the next few weeks or few months at the very most. And they're being revised all the time, so you adjust your predictions to how things actually develop. The second thesis is that positivism encourages dogmatism. Because there's no room for conceptual work, there's also no room for conceptual histories, which means that there's very little space for any rational disagreements either. And then because of the requirement of operationalization, the idea is that either words have a particular given meaning or they don't have any meaning at all. So we can't actually argue about concepts that in fact we know are very historical and in a complex ways connected to other concepts within conceptual frameworks. And even from a kind of a libertarianist perspective, but from an Austrian school perspective, one can talk about reacting against these decades of arrogant positivist hegemony, of an alleged testing of economic theory that never really takes place, and of lofty statements by positivists that I don't understand what you mean, when they know darn well what you mean, but they actually disagree with it. And that's not a good starting point for any kind of a dialogue. Furthermore, when we are talking, or when they are talking about laws and equilibriums, theorems, and corollaries to those theorems, and so on and so forth, and then naming those after their creators, they give the impression that the foundation of economics is something very close to the foundations of mathematics or physics. But in fact, the plausibility of all this relies on the 19th century idea, not so popular anymore, of the scientific method and related method fetishisms, based on the idea that physics provides a model for all the other sciences. But not even in natural sciences people are anymore following that scheme at all. In many fields, from geology to biology, life sciences, and so on, the approach is nowadays much more open, systemic, and historical in all kinds of ways. The studying idiosyncratic histories by way of using a wide variety of different kinds of evidence in making their arguments, including also philosophical arguments. So this idea of borrowing from Newton, Lagrange, Hamilton and other physicists the basic mathematical concepts and so on and so forth is actually a hindrance and obstacle to learning, because by creating a system that makes the appearance of being certain means that you have very little room for actual learning. The third thesis is not that people are not rational, it's that rationality is not what economists claim that rationality is. I call it econ rationality. It's a rationality according to which decision is one that is optimal for achieving a preferred and self-interested goal in marginalist terms. And this marginalism is quite important, not because it would bear any relationship to how people actually reason or behave, but because it enables the use of these Lagrangian, Hamiltonian mathematical tools. Then you can actually adopt this analogy between Newtonian mechanics or Lagrangian mechanics and economics. Without marginalism, that wouldn't be possible. So marginalism is very important from a methodological point of view. So that has to be defended at all costs. However, we know from a wide variety of sources, including also from within economics, from experimental and behavioral studies, that this kind of utility maximizing consumers do not exist. It's simple as that. And it's not even rational. If you have tens of thousands of different commodities and services, rational people don't form transitive preference relations across this huge spectrum of possibilities. It would be totally irrational. We humans are much more clever than that. We can very quickly pick up our choices because we have learned to do that also in nature, original evolutionary schemes. We can very quickly know things on the basis of images and prototypes and framings. And this is what people actually do. But also these framings, prototypes, images, and many of them are also based on explicit beliefs about certain things, and we can form habits on the basis of those habits of consumption, habits of doing things in a particular way. These are also related to our social positioning in society. So here's another link. Once you give up marginalism, which is necessary for the use of certain kinds of mathematical tools, you can clearly see that economics is just another social science dealing with similar kinds of questions than people like Pierre Bourdieu, for instance, in sociology, making distinctions and creating social classes and so on and so forth, and that's the very basis of their choices also in the marketplace. But what is more, even if this kind of atomistic, non-social, econ-rational utility maximizing consumer existed, there's no way we can actually derive social indifference curves, which is necessary for the so-called law of demand from them, without assuming that there's only one unchanging person in society. And furthermore, there are other conceptions of rationality, much more comprehensive. And from that perspective, this particular kind of or particular conceptualization of one particular kind of rationality is only one type among many. I don't have time to go into those. The fourth thesis is that the so-called law of demand doesn't exist. And the fifth is that the so-called law of supply doesn't exist either. And with these two basic tools, most of the neoclassical economic models and theories fall apart. So it's impossible to derive logically an aggregate smoothly downward sloping demand function for the society as a whole from the basic assumptions of neoclassical theory concerning individual preferences. In the absence of empirical evidence, what the neoclassical economists usually try to do is to give some kind of a mathematical proof for the existence of this social demand curve. But it turns out it's only possible in a society where you have one good and one consumer. It's almost like you only had clothes for sale, and only type of clothes that was for sale was the Maoist type of obligatory suit that everybody was wearing in China in the 1950s and 60s, and nothing else is possible. Of course, you can rationalize this by using obscure technical terminology. References are assumed to be homothetic, so people who don't know what homothetic means can easily buy into this argument. Or affine in income, same thing. Nothing changes when your incomes increase or decrease, or the distribution of incomes in society changes, so nothing happens to the social indifference curve. This is the logical part, so it's been shown time and again that it's impossible to derive the so-called law of demand from the basic assumptions of rationality and preference. But then empirically, there is no universal, well-defined invariance to that effect either. If you look at more carefully what a law actually would be like, a Newtonian basic law, F is m times a, net force times mass times, net force is mass times acceleration. I mean, this is very precisely defined and it's always the same. The form of relationship is well defined and precise. The constants and measures used in the equation are and have been verified many times in all kinds of measurements. They're strictly precise, they're unchanging, and they're well defined. There's nothing like that in economics. Of course, also in natural systems, there are open systems. There are many forces affecting the outcome. So, for instance, I mean, if we let a thing fall, the acceleration depends also on other things, including the pressure of air. But those can be estimated, even in the absence of any laboratory experiments in vacuum, that nowadays are possible, but in the 17th century we are not. You can still estimate the force of these other factors. In economics, you have only this generic term, ceteris paribus, for everything that you don't know anything about. And there's actually an major ontological difference as well. Whereas the mechanism of force, let's say gravity, in Newtonian mechanics, I mean, it has a clear and separate existence. In society, people's choices are not like that, they're contextual. And that's how human mind that is constituted by language and society operates. So there's an ontological difference as well. And that's the reason why there is no separate thing called law of demand and a related force that could be somehow separated from all the other contextual factors or components. There isn't anything like that. So the law of demand doesn't exist. Here's a list of all kinds of other things that in fact affect the way people make choices. If you look at the relationship between price and quantity in any given market, in real time, this aggregate demand curve can go at any given point, whichever way, up or down. There might be kind of some kind of a negative correlation between the two overall, but for any given commodity in any given point in time, there is no pre-given relationship. It's not well defined, it's not precise, it's not unchanging. And the same holds true for the law of supply as well. It doesn't exist. There is no upward sloping demand curve, and there is no continuous downward sloping supply curve either. I use different arguments here. The argument of Schumpeter is quite important. Every innovation means a shift to a new curve. But what is more important, even more important in a way, but related, is that for any fragment of this curve that might exist, it's never actually, there is no increase in marginal cost for production. Rather, the costs are usually either constant or falling for industrial goods. but for many other goods it might be different. Again, it's very context dependent as well. And there simply isn't any law of supply. The sixth thesis is, and a lot of economics research, and not only teaching, is based on this concept of equilibrium. It doesn't make any sense in the real world political economy. And there are several reasons for this. I mean, it only makes sense if you have precise equations that you can somehow, multiple equations that you can solve. In the absence of laws that can be described mathematically, that are precise, well-defined, and unchanging, this concept of equilibrium doesn't make any sense. And of course, in the real world, economists don't know where this equilibrium would be. Whenever they talk about it in the connection of the real markets, they simply assume the location of that equilibrium, if they ever talk about it at all. They never study it, they have no idea where it would be in the real world. And there's a reason for it. The concept doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have any reference in the real world. The related and further point is that the distinction between micro and macro theory is also unfounded. When Keynes criticized what he called classical economics or political economy, he wanted to refound economics as a discipline. It was a scientific revolution in its own way. But what happened very quickly, I mean, starting with this famous review by Hicks in 1937, where he actually proposed his own theory instead of Keynes's theory, and that provided the basis for the so-called ISLM model later on, which was a particular formulation of Keynes's theory, which was had nothing to do with Keynes himself. At this point, and starting from that point onwards, there was this labeling of this particular theory as the macro theory. And then the classical, neoclassical economic theory would be the micro theory. That was not Keynes's intention, and there is no ontological foundation to take this effect. Keynes's argument was rather that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. You can't start from the small parts and then derive some sort of overall consequences on that basis. In fact, the logic of neoclassical microeconomic theory is similar to the effort to prove that the Earth is flat. You take a small segment of the planet, it seems flat, you add them up, it's proven, QED, the Earth is flat, right? The logic is similar. There is no separate micro and macro theory. There's only what in social theory we call the agency structure problem, and that's an ontological problem. The 8 theses, I'm cheating a bit, in fact there are 11 theses. This 8 is divided into 2. As a consequence of all these other things, the so-called first welfare theorem is simply false. It's not only false empirically or something like that, but it can't be true. The standard definition of a perfectly competitive market is that there is a very large number of buyers and sellers, but perfect rationality and perfect information. Of course, what does perfect rationality and perfect information mean? It also implies, among many other things, that every actor can predict everything about the future to the eternity. But it also presupposes econ rationality that doesn't exist, and laws that do not exist either. It also implies that society is a horde of clones, consuming communities which are identical to each other. It also implies closed systems. There are no internal changes, no learning, no innovation, no growth, no profits, or no marketing, or product differentiation, or anything like that. It's an impossible world. And for that reason, it's also elusive, particularly when it's represented as a kind of a standard against which everything else is compared. It is totally delusional. There's nothing perfect about perfectly competitive markets. I mean, can you imagine a modern economy with no change, no learning, no innovation, no growth, no profits, no marketing? but it's not even competitive. If you think about competition in terms of Joseph Schumpeter, nobody is competing. I mean, they're just price takers in a homogeneous market with multiple sellers and buyers. Nothing happens there. There's no competition. Ask any businessman and you will know. The world is very real, very different from this world. The problem is really that this is not only not true, it's also impossible. It's simply, there is no possible world within which this kind of perfectly competitive market could occur. So the representation of this flawed model as a normative yardstick is utopian. Utopia is a place nowhere. But it's not only utopian, it's also delusive and very likely to be, in practice, counterproductive. And neoclassical economists should know, already in the 1950s, Lipsy and Lancaster showed that if there are like two things that don't match with the so-called perfectly competitive markets, very often it's much better to move away from that model than towards it in terms of increasing welfare as defined under the neoclassical assumptions. So the representation of this model as the basis for thinking about capitalist market economy is totally misleading. Now, mainstream economics agrees about positivism and deductivism. They don't always agree about this substantial way of thinking about the economy in terms of the perfectly competitive markets being the yardstick, the normative ideal. There are other approaches. The new Keynesian economists, including Krugman, Roderick, Stiglitz, and others, they follow the same methodology, but they have relaxed certain assumptions. We have also post-Keynesians that have relaxed much more of these assumptions and don't take many of these neoclassical assumptions as given at all. But nonetheless, they too assume that science is about positivist and deductivist model building involving closed systems with many equations and possible equilibriums as well. And we even have analytical Marxists that do the same thing. They might have relaxed even more of some other of those assumptions, but nonetheless, they still believe that this is the methodology of doing social sciences. Of course, these don't matter that much as far as the practical implications of economic theory are concerned. Analytical Marxism is not that vibrant anymore. It hasn't been since the 1980s, and neither it nor post-Keynesian theory is being taught in the curriculum of most universities, including the University of Helsinki. And finally, final thesis is that for these reasons, even though there might be more room for substantial disagreements even within this methodology, in actual practice, the neoclassical or mainstream economics tends to converge on the free market ideal. And this is also what I call the habitus of economist, using the term of Pierre Bourdieu. It's a system of dispositions, cognitive and motivational structures, and practical skills of making normative judgments that they've learned through their education and professional activities. And it's very deeply anchored in their daily professional practices. The problem is that this habitus includes certain form of dogmatism, which is encouraged by this positivist method theory, and also predisposition towards favoring free markets. And at the ultimate level, it's all about the 19th century idea of scientific method. And many people don't believe in that method anymore in other fields, including in many natural sciences. And in a way, this is an ingenious construction to use the Lagrangian and Newtonian mathematical tools in the context of economics. But the unfortunate thing is that in order to make this possible, you need actually systematic and multi-layered confusions between what is merely imaginary, that is fiction, what may in fact be real, maybe, but doesn't mean that it actually is. It even can't be real in many cases. and what is presented as normatively ideal, but giving the distinction between positive and normative economics, famously, for instance, developed by Milton Friedman. This presentation or representation of what is normatively ideal is always ambiguous and half-hearted. And it is because there's no room for any normative argumentation in classical economics. They do it anyway in the actual practice, but they don't have any conception for it. This imaginary, I conclude, is self-contained because it is disconnected from the historical social realities. And dialogue with other social scientists seems possible only to the extent that they adopt the same imaginary world as their object of study, and also, what is more, in the same positivist, deductivist terms, whatever their concrete field. And this is basically the project of economics imperialism that we have heard so much about. The problem lies ultimately in those unexamined methodological premises in neoclassical economics. I end here and give the floor to Hannu. Thank you.
Let me just explain the format again. These two speakers were supposed to use 15 or 20 minutes each for making their opening statements. Heikki a bit more. We'll see how will perform in this respect. And after that, they will be given a chance to comment on each other's statements a few times, and then the rest of you will be given the floor for further comments and questions and objections.
All right. Thank you very much, Heikki, for the very entertaining presentation. And thank you, Uspali, for arranging this occasion. It's a pleasure to be here. What can I say? Well, first of all, I'm a theorist, so I will respond to Heikki's points from the economics theory point of view. There is an important part of economics which is related to empirical research, of course, but I mainly will deal with theory questions, which I think were actually the point of attack of Heikki in his presentation. Okay, so I will begin by revealing my position. I think that Heikki's opinions were, there were lots of misconceptions behind them. Some of the arguments, I think, were flat wrong. Some of the points I heavily disagree, and some I didn't understand. So therefore, I think that we have a kind of a situation where discussion is useful. Because I basically didn't agree on anything. So for the sake of brevity, I would only focus on the key points. Well, I'm only going to have one key argument here, which I'm going to develop first, and then I'm going to apply to Heikki's points. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going through all the items in this slide. But let me begin with one of the sort of, well, I'm a dilettante here, so in the philosophy question, so bear with me. But I think that the basic point, basic difficulty here between Heikki's approach and mine, and I guess that with many economic theorists, is a conception of the work. What kind of a place do we live in? And I'm not talking about capitalist, socialist, or good or bad or anything like that, but I'm talking about whether it's big or small. I think that anyone who argues that we can deduce individual behavior, human behavior, behavior of the society from the basic assumptions believes that there are basic assumptions that describe our reality, thinks at the same time that we are living in some sense in a small world, which can be described in a meaningful way. on the other hand, if we think that we are living in a big world, in a big in a sense that it's huge, it's indescribable in some sense, then the best we can do is to create some understanding. Rather than describing the world, we create some understanding. And I guess that this is the position that many economic theories share. We are living in a big world. Therefore, it's hopeless task to try to describe it in detail or even approximate it. And that's, I think, the sort of philosophical underpinning of the disagreement here. Okay, but let me go to the little bit more detailed discussion. So, the starting point of my talk is sort of short description of what, in my opinion, economics or economic theory is trying to accomplish. The objective of economic theory is to try to understand, emphasis is understanding, how the economy and the society at large works. It's the understanding part. We try to relate observables, observations, recognize patterns, and see the big picture. We try to relate natural things that are intuitively meaningful to one another so that we create understanding how the system works. And economic theory here is not a description of the world, but rather a modeling framework. And there is a huge difference to what how Heikki interpreted what our enterprise is all about. It's a framework where we think about, where we analyze things. And by a model, I mean here a concrete way of organizing the data to understand the observables. The model always has a purpose. We don't start with the assumptions and then develop some understanding based on the assumptions, but rather we have a purpose whenever we model something. And that's the thing. That's the key idea. So let me illustrate. So there are these things called assumptions. Then there are these things that are called predictions that we somehow deduce from the assumptions to the predictions. So I guess that many think that the assumptions should be realistic. They should be somehow, there should be correspondence to the real world. And the goodness of a theory depends on how well these assumptions reflect reality. Or some people think that it's the predictions that, whether predictions are good, that depends on, that dictates whether the theory is good or not. But actually, that's not how economic theorists think. It's the thing that is in between that matters. And that's where our focus is. We want to create understanding, and it's this part here that creates this understanding. Not the assumptions, not the predictions, but the thing that happens in between. It's the analysis. That's the key part. So anything that we do, anything that economic theory does, is about analysis. And it's all the assumptions that we make facilitate this part here. So there is a crucial difference to what the sort of neoclassical paradigm, as Heikki indicated, would say. So when we think about the theory or a framework of economics, we should not judge the assumptions whether they are true or false, or even the predictions whether they are true or false. The theory should be, or the framework should be judged based on how well it works. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about equilibrium concept, for example. Well, Rationality equilibrium in the neoclassical, in the general equilibrium theory is an equilibrium concept. But in game theory, there are lots of other equilibrium concepts, Nash equilibria, subimperfect Nash equilibria, and so forth and so on. So these are the frameworks that we use to analyze models, and depending on how well the solution concept, for example, works, is the determinant how good the theory is. Not how well it predicts, not how realistic the assumptions are, but how versatile, how useful the model is in understanding different observations and how applicable in different scenarios the model is. And finally, the key point, the key aspect of understanding of any kind is simplicity. It's basically almost a synonym of understanding. We don't understand complex things. We understand simple things. This is the Occam's razor. So that's why we want to develop models that are as simple as possible, of course, not simpler, but nevertheless, as simple as possible that still help us to understand the reality where we live. That's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so what are the basic assumptions in the framework of economics? Oh, not assumptions, dimensions or aspects of the framework. And the following. Well, first of all, we are methodological individualism. What do I mean by that? Why is it that economics appeals to relies on individualism as a methodology? It's because we want to understand. And the human being is the basic obstacle whose behavior we really can understand. And aggregating from there keeps the whole system understandable. So the other assumptions, the other methodological assumptions that we make are really methodological as well. They are rationality assumption and the equilibrium assumptions. These are at the fundamental level really methodological assumptions. They are not ontological assumptions, but methodological. They facilitate our analysis and allow us to focus on something that we are interested in, which is, for example, the markets, the society, whatever, system of consisting of human beings. And importantly, the rationality assumption allows us to integrate our models to the reality, to the data, through the so-called revealed preference argument. Revealed preference argument is basically a synonym for rationality, for maximization of preference. But it allows us to sort of calibrate the observations that we see and create the utility function, if you wish, from there. But it's basically the same thing as assuming maximization. Equilibrium, on the other hand, is not something that, again, it's not something that we expect to see or touch or, evaluate, verify. It's a methodological assumption that it's a consistent way of aggregating behavior into single understandable concept. And that's why we can then analyze something that is complex. Something that is complex becomes simple and it's analyzable. Of course, contrary to what many people think, there is no normative content in the concept of equilibrium. It's just a way to aggregate in a consistent way of behavior of the society. Okay, so the usefulness, that's something that I don't go now. But okay, so I'm now based on the basis of what I just explained in the last 2 slides. I'm going to evaluate some of the criticism of Heikki in a little bit more detail. So in red is the sort of a critical claim, and then in blue, well, how I respond to it. So rationality is one of the sort of dearest cases where economics is criticized. So and of course the typical criticism is that it's not rational. We all have one data point ourselves that demonstrates that, well, in most of the cases, at least in my case, rationality is a little bit demanding assumption. But of course, many people claim that you can generalize this observation. So rationality is not realistic assumption. Is that a problem? It doesn't matter, I mean, from the point of view that I just explained, rationality is not an ontological assumption. It doesn't concern the reality or behavior of individuals. It's a methodological assumption, literally. It helps us to organize the data that we see through the revealed preferences argument and calibrate the utility function preferences in a way that could possibly be used elsewhere in applied work. Importantly, the rationality assumption helps us to understand the behavior. We don't assume something, a concrete, simple way how people behave, then we don't really understand how they do behave. So economists are often accused of not being empathetic. I think that's completely wrong. It's precisely the maximization assumption, rationality assumption, that makes people's behavior understandable. Importantly, unlike many people think, rationality does not imply wealth maximization. It just means that we can make comparison, apple or banana. These comparisons are something that we can do, and they are the reflection of rationality. Nothing more, not related to money, wealth, prosperity, anything like that. Okay, so, and importantly, alternative models, I mean there are alternative models, have not proven very useful. People have tried them, but actually, when you start analyzing what you are really interested in, which is the market, the society, bigger things, complex, if you put something complex behavioral rules into the model, you get something complex out. And that's not something that we want. We want to have something that is understandable. So, satisfying, for example, has not been proven very useful in applied work. Representative agent needed. Representative agent is not needed in our models. There is no reason whatsoever to argue that we need to have representative agents. Okay, so what about laws of economics and excessive use of mathematics? Law of demand is not really a law. Indeed, it's not a real law in the literal sense of the word. But on the other hand, think about the opposite. Suppose that the law of demand is not a law, that it's the converse is true. Then what is happening is that once you start increasing the price, you get more demand. What's your suppose that would happen? Then suppose I'm a shopkeeper and I'm taking that kind of a demand function. Well, I don't know. First of all, I would become extremely rich, and second of all, I don't know what to do because I would have all the money in the world after a couple of seconds. So the thing here is that when we are dealing with law of demand or something equivalent, it's again an assumption that rings a bell. It's plausible, but that's not the main reason why we are making such an assumption. The main reason is, in addition to it being plausible, is that it helps us to focus on bigger things. We don't have to worry about small things. We can put our focus on big things when we want to analyze. Actually, anyone who has done any kind of analytical work in economics or elsewhere, knows that to be able to deal with complex systems, you need to make assumptions that allow you to separate different things in the system, isolate them. Therefore, you need to have monotonicity assumptions of some sort, independency assumptions of some sort, to be able to analyze the big system. Without those, the whole thing is too complex to get anything out, really. So that's another reason, perhaps the key reason, why we often, in applied work, assume something like law of demand. In addition, for it being, one could generate it easily from almost any kind. Most of the preferences would generate law of demand. However, there are, of course, well-known examples of the cases where law of demand doesn't work, and it's not a surprise to economists that it does not always work. But nevertheless, the point is that we are assuming something like this in applied work, in macro work, for example, because without assumptions like this, our models would not work. And this is part of the art of modeling, actually. The art of modeling is a crucial element of doing economics. Because, as I explained before, we want to get the model work. It's the red thing in the middle that we want to have sharp insights. So therefore, you need to calibrate your assumptions in a way that you get the insight. That's the art of modeling and actually art of doing economic theory. Okay, what about this mathematics envy that some people argue that economists have? There are laws and equilibria and theorems and corollaries and so forth and so on. And okay, the argument goes that the illusion is created that economics has because these are used to sound scientific or something equivalent. I totally disagree. Names, laws, theories, whatever, are very helpful. When you start talking about Arrow's theorem, Coe's theorem, Nash equilibria, Hotelling's model, whatever, you immediately know what kind of a concept are we talking about without having to lay down all the details of the model. So it's a sort of a feature of a developed field that we have these bigger concepts. Of course, we could name them in some other way, but it wouldn't change really the concept. So what about the concept of a theorem, for example? Why is it that we use a concept of theorem in a discipline like economics that deals with human beings who are not machines, at least not in the traditional sense of the word, but so that they function in a complex way? Can we really prove theorems on individuals? No. We prove theorems in a model. Based on our assumptions, we prove theorems. The theorems are a handy way to describe our results. And that's it. There is nothing more scientific. It's just a convenient way to communicate complex issues. While theorems are, of course, always tautological in the formal sense of the word, they are not. They are far from tautological in the humanistic sense of the word. If you take any layman or even an expert in the field, most of the theorems really require heavy concentration to understand the proof. So therefore, it's extremely important that you communicate them in the transparent as possible way. That's the whole content of this mathematization of economics. We want to be precise, we want to be concrete, and we want to become understood without misconception. There is nothing foundational in the idea of doing mathematical modeling. The mathematics as such does not try to pretend to be any more foundational than verbal statement of things. It's just more convenient, accurate, precise. Leaves no room for misunderstanding. However, even if we use extensively mathematical methods or formal methods, economics is not applied mathematics. We are not talking about mathematics, we are talking about humans and society. But we are using in a way that leaves no room for misconception. Okay, equilibrium does not make sense in the real world. Without rationality, closed system laws, and describable system to equations, equilibrium makes no sense. Well, equilibrium, as I said before, is just a consistency condition permitting aggregation of behavior. That's it. It's not an ontological concept, it's a methodological one. It's handy way to understand interaction. And it's quite hard for me to come up with really sort of, you know, if you are really trying to think things through, to come up with any kind of another way of consistently describing individual interaction between humans. And the emphasis here is consistency. Well, is equilibrium an ideologically motivated concept? Well, equilibrium is a method. Can method be ideologically motivated? Okay, first welfare theorem is false and delusive. Well, first of all, first welfare theorem does not require perfect competition. It just requires price-taking behavior. There is a big difference in those. You can apply first welfare theorem even on small societies. It requires crazy assumptions, including large numbers of similar agents with perfect information, homogeneous commodity that is not, and the first welfare theorem is not true in any possible way. Sorry, but these are these simply are not. First welfare theorem can be generated with all generalized over all these dimensions. The representation of the first welfare theorem is a normative yardstick. Representation of the first welfare theorem as a normative yardstick is counterproductive. As I said before, I didn't say perhaps. First welfare theorem answers the puzzle of the aim of the first welfare theorem is to answer the puzzle of how should we aggregate over different markets. When there is just one market, it's fairly easy. You have the demand function, and then you have the supply function, and then something like this happens. But what about when there are many markets? That's the only the key content of the welfare theorem that analyze general equilibrium with multiple markets. Can we sustain the welfare properties of a single market? And finding that indeed we can is a major advancement in the analysis. That's the idea of the. But the point of the welfare theorem is to be educated. It's not. No one believes that it's accurate description of the world. It's aimed to understand how and when exactly work well. Just like if you compare this to the famous impossibility theorem of Arrow. Arrow proved that under reasonable aggregation rule, take the societies, the only way to make decisions is the dictatorship. Well, do we conclude from there that yes, we should put up a dictatorship because that's the only reasonable way to make the decisions in the society? No, it just implies that politics matters. That there are different. We cannot conclude. There is no obvious way to make decisions when there are many individuals in the society. The result is akin to that. There are it's a benchmark solution that can be used as a comparison when we look how the world really looks like. Okay. Then before I conclude, let me go to this accusation of the argument that economists are dogmatic and arrogant and ideologically committed. Well, arrogance may be a consequence of the method-driven discipline. But the reason for that is only that we want to be precise. We want to avoid misunderstanding. Ideologically committed to free markets advocates that, and that economists advocate capitalism. The last sentence is actually not. This part is not actually from Heikki's slides now, but elsewhere in the many people have argued that that's the archetypical feature of economists. This is actually one of the most disturbing claims of all. I mean, even if I can't come up with any ideologically demanding issue where the economists that I know would agree on. I mean, I'm sure that no one in economics would agree that we advocate some kind of an ideological position. And we are sort of part of some kind of a conspiracy. I mean, that's yeah, I mean, I must say that that's a little bit disturbing idea. So if you think about the free market doctrine, but I think that the useful way to think about it is, and I think that many economists agree, that economics is really about distributing scarce resources. That's a sort of a question of corporate. We want to get the best out of the resources, scarce resources that we have. How to do that? Market mechanism is a good mechanism. It functions well, but it's not the only mechanism. But it's the precise feature of the market mechanism is that it enhances cooperation, division of labor. That is one form of cooperation. Of course, we can come up with other kinds of mechanisms. They have good features and bad features, but nevertheless, there is no commitment as such to the market mechanism or to capitalism even, as such among economists. It's a good mechanism and it's easy to understand. That's why we often assume in practical modeling. Okay, that's, yeah, okay. The conspiracy, yeah. Okay, so one of the common theme in this literature is that conspiracy theory, that we are somehow part of some kind of a conspiracy with capitalists. I think that you know, conspiracy theories are kind of exciting, but they are not very challenging intellectually. You cannot prove it. They are not, or you cannot ever disprove it. When you claim something against the conspiracy theory, it just shows that you are part of the conspiracy. So you cannot disprove it. Okay, to conclude. How I see economic theory is that it's an effective language. Formalism makes the arguments transparent and facilitates communication. It works well in robust environments. It doesn't work well always. Like any theory, any model doesn't. I mean, if you haven't falsified a theory, it just means that you didn't find the right data. So it gives meaning to quantifiable variables, which is very important for practical decision making, or actually crucially important for modern society. As any language, it can be used to say crazy things, but that's not the word. It's not the form of the language. Rationality are an equilibrium of methods, not ontological concepts. And in a model, assumptions facilitate insight, not the other way around. There is no ideological commitment whatsoever, in my opinion. And I would say that when we are, I mean, actually, my feeling is that Heikki is actually criticizing how economics is taught in the universities, like the autism criticism in the beginning. And that's okay. We can criticize how economics is taught, but deducing conclusions how economics as a discipline is conducted based on textbook analysis is quite ambitious idea. Textbooks are simplistic for didactic reasons, and for example, so-called heterodox criticism of economics ignores the last 50 years of research. So therefore, when we say that why does mainstream economics appear self-contained and arrogant, I do think that it is a misunderstanding. Thank you.
Thank you. sounds like indeed you guys need some help. The charge was that Heikki is flat wrong, heavily disagreeable statements, incomprehensible statements and all that. So I think it's only fair to give you the floor for, but please use a bit less time than when making your opening statement.
Yes, I will be brief. The conspiracy theories, they're intellectually exciting but can't be proved. That's exactly like neoclassical economics. Exactly the same thing. Intellectually exciting, and particularly if you like mathematics, I mean, they give you all kinds of interesting things to do, but they can't be proved. In fact, they are wrong, and they are false. The only criteria that the Hannu gave for the validity of that theory is how well it works. But he didn't specify for what or for whom. In critical global political economy, Robert Cox's famous distinction between problem solving and critical theory is based on the idea that we always have to ask the question, theory for what and for whom. This pertains only also the question how applicable a theory is. Applicable to what? If we can't predict anything, and if we can't explain anything, if it's not true, in what sense is it applicable? Just take the case of revealed preferences, for instance. I mean, if you're convinced from the outset that there are things like preferences, and they follow certain logic, that the Samuelson conditions, for instance, apply, convex, transitive, and so on. And then you observe how people behave, and you've heard the preferences from them. So you have proven the starting point by just making a tautological observation. But if those choices, in fact, reveal nothing like preferences, if they reveal something like framings of things, prototypes, metaphorical ways of reasoning, and so on and so forth, then you're dead wrong. And you're wrong because you have already assumed the conclusion before doing your research. And that's the problem for economics. Now, compare this idea that the point is to how well a theory works, how useful it is for some unspecified purpose, and how good it is for providing some sort of an understanding. What's the difference between a classical economic theory and astrology? Astrology is also very good in terms of giving you certain understanding about different human personalities and characters, and also about their possible futures as well. If we are not interested in the truth of our claims, if we are not trying to falsify anything, but just interested in providing or getting some understanding, astrology is exactly as good as neoclassical theory. There's no difference. But take another example, a bit more relevant in this context perhaps, but logically speaking, quite different case, that of Marxism. And just for the sake of argument, let's take only one strand of Marxism, the strand of analytical Marxism. It also provides us understanding. Why is that not taught as the basic thing in economics? It's not, for particular reasons, because I mean the understanding sought in neoclassical economics is a very particular understanding, for some unspecified purpose and for some unspecified audience. And I think the charge of being ideological, I think the economist should plead guilty as charged. The idea that rationality is something that helps us to organize the data. The econ rationality is not what rationality in general is. There are all kinds of other forms of rationality. Just take Jürgen Habermas's theory of communicative action. You have at least 4 different categories of rationality. And one of them is communicative rationality, the basis of everything else. If an economist is trying to make an argument against another economist who actually disagrees with him about a particular economic model or theory or something like that, I mean, a consistent economist would have to conclude that this is a persuasive game, a strategic game where you're trying to win. Truth has no bearing on the matter. And you play the game very cleverly, you win. But what you say might have nothing to do with any sort of truth whatsoever. Because there's no room for communicative rationality. There's no room for anything like rational persuasion or for truth. There are also other kinds of rationalities, including normative or practical rationality. Most of social sciences are in fact concerned with that form of rationality. And in fact it has a lot to do with choices in the markets, or also about the choice between markets and non-markets. If you commodify something, introduce a market where it didn't used to exist, you actually change the logic of behavior from normatively oriented social behavior to something very different. And to the surprise of most neoclassical economists, the outcome is usually perverse or paradoxical. And this is because they don't understand any other form of rationality than their own. Whereas Habermas or any social scientist can also see a place for this modern invention called Zweckrationalität, as Max Weber put it, or instrumental rationality. Being only one form of rationality, not necessarily satisfying the conditions of Samuelson or anybody else, is not following the marginalist tenets, but it's still instrumentally oriented. And that kind of rationality does exist, but so do many other rationalities as well. So I don't think that the idea that rationality helps to organize our data makes any sense unless you have bought into the argument that there's only one type of rationality in the world, and that is the econ rationality. There's also this claim that unless we make certain kinds of assumptions, like monotheity, for instance, we can't make any conclusions. But this is also presupposes the same positivist idea that the only way we can draw any conclusions is by way of using deductive or mathematical logic and modeling exercise. Which means, of course, by definition, that all the other social scientists or human scientists can say nothing about the world because they don't follow that logic. Exactly the opposite is true. Because human beings don't reason in terms of deductive or mathematical logic. There are no preferences that follow the conditions of Samuelson. Their marginalism doesn't hold. It has no corresponding thing in the world or mechanism in the world. The economists who are thinking that this is the only form of rationality and everything has to be explained in those terms are dead wrong. They have created an imaginary world which seems to be following the same laws of physics as in basic Newtonian or Lagrangian or Hamiltonian models. No physicist would start their basic introductory course by introducing their students to models that they would, in the fifth year, finally admit are not true at all. What they start with are well-founded natural laws that can be easily specified, are precise, measurable, verifiable, falsifiable, and so on and so forth, and they are true. Newtonian mechanism is true. It only is true for certain parts of reality or aspect or layer of reality. That is closest to our everyday world. This is exactly the opposite logic to neoclassical economics. You start something that can't possibly be true. And then at the postdoctoral level or doctoral level, you tell them that this is not in fact true. Here's a more technical model that somehow might be a bit better approximation of reality, but also this is in fact not true. I don't think that's science.
I expect you to want to respond.
Okay, yes, thank you. Thanks for the good comments. Yeah, okay, just a couple of responses. I don't know, we're talking about truth here, I guess. I have no idea what that means. I don't know whether there is something like that in that we could, compellingly get out in social sciences. We have models, we have interpretations, we have frameworks, but we don't have, in my opinion, truth. Truth is a concept that is defined within a model. It's not defined, I feel that it's a little bit ambitious to say that it's well-defined concept outside a model. Actually, I would argue that whenever we are talking about truth as such, we implicitly have in mind a model that we fit in this concept in. And not being explicit of what we are talking about is not very revealing. But in economics, we try to be precise in concepts and in the concept of truth. And we have tried to be very modest in that. That we see, your final point was that there are differences in how we teach physics and how we teach economics. Completely true. And that's how it should be. Economics is not physics. We do not pretend to be physics, and they do not pretend to be economics. So there is precisely because of these reasons, because we are humans and we are studying humans, there are fundamental problems in coming up with a reductionist framework where we can start from the bottom and then go to the up. I think that there are fundamental knowledge-based problems in social sciences in that respect. So therefore, teaching also should be different. And then final point, if I may, the final response concerns the rationality assumption. I agree, there probably are at least 4 different versions of rationality. I would imagine that there might, I would have suggested that there are even, or anticipated that there are even more. But we are not claiming that rationality, the concept that we use, is, covers all the notions of rationality. It depends on your definition. But we use this particular definition, and it's very forceful, and I still maintain my argument that you really cannot falsify that at the core. Revealed preferences is a principle, not a theory. You cannot falsify it. It's a methodological approach. Unlike you argued, you cannot, based on your observations, deduce that no, this guy is not maximizing based on his choices. That's simply not doable thing unless you assume something else concerning his or her preferences or utilities. Okay, but I guess that it's...
All right. Let me interfere here by offering a perspective as to how to organize this debate and how to understand the framework of criticism, because there are many ways of criticizing an approach, a discipline, a theory, whatever. First of all, by having a shared understanding of what the goals are, and then criticizing the exercise in terms of the possible failure in attaining those goals. But I'm not sure that you agree on what the goals of economics are and how economics has set out to pursue the attainment of those goals. For instance, here is where I differ with Heikki. I don't think there is any sort of positivistic commitments behind economics. I think that's and also the ambitions of economics in terms of pursuing some laws akin to physical laws or anything like that. I don't think that's part of the explicit and official business of economic inquiry, at least nowadays. It may have been so long ago, but it's no more so. And in order to understand economics, we need to understand this modeling style of doing inquiry in terms of models. And I think that's what also Hannu has been talking about. So he should be attacked in those terms. And let me try to attack you. Because you emphasize understanding. All right. Now, for understanding the world, we need to understand the theory or model that we use for understanding the world. But it sounds to me that you are emphasizing the first part only, namely understanding the theory or the model, rather than using the theory or model for understanding the world. I fully agree that models are very important in the reduction of complexity. This big world is hugely complex, and the complexity must be reduced, and modeling is a way of reducing this complexity. But then there are huge risks in using models for trying to reduce the complexity of understanding that complex world in terms of simple models. And you keep emphasizing the importance of understanding, but it seems to me that the focus of understanding is the understanding of these models rather than the understanding of the world.
Okay, well that's certainly an important point. And unfortunately, I'm a theorist, so I'm looking at the model. But there are, of course, lots of people in the audience as well who are doing empirical research. They start with a model, and then they look at the data, and then they look at the correspondence, and then they deduce whether there is a correspondence or not. But as a theorist, of course, what we do, what I do, or what theorists do, is that we have a sort of the data is the sort of in the broad sense of the word, that we have experiences and all kinds of data from the past, and then in the intuitive sense we connect things together in a creative way. But I totally agree. It's very important to have a connection between the model and the real world. But that's the sort of the other part which I didn't talk about.
Right. There's another thing on which I think I'm side with Heikki perhaps, and this relates to truth, the importance of truth and all those things. I mean, from a historical perspective, I think you guys, I mean, economists today should be aware of this historical development regarding the self-understanding of economics. Nowadays, you keep saying this thing that these are only methodological principles, equilibrium, rationality, and all that. It's a method-oriented discipline and all that. But this used not to be the case in the past. Economics sort of was in the self-proclaimed business of pursuing truth about the world. So when did this change? And is it okay for it to have changed in such a way that you can now sort of retreat from the responsibility of pursuing truths about the world by saying these are only methodological principles and all that?
Should I? Well, I think that it was the origin of general equilibrium theory that changed the focus on understanding the theory framework more deeply and understanding the boundaries of the framework and understanding what the model implies. Of course, game theory revolution in the 70s and 80s changed the gear also towards that direction, which you just described. Because game theory is an extremely flexible language that we can use to analyze basically anything. By the way, one thing that I would like to also emphasize that what Heikki was suggesting, that there are important phenomena in economics that we cannot model or we cannot understand in the standard economics framework. Actually, I would be surprised if that's true. The problem of economics is not predicting too little, but to predict too much. Because of the enormous flexibility of the framework. You really have to use your own judgment to say that this is important, this is my prediction. Put your own, commit to your model, rather than saying that this is my model. I'll just start with these assumptions and let's see where it goes. There are very little boundaries on what can be explained with the framework that I introduced. It's the commitment of the researcher to say something meaningful in that sense, to restrict your attention to meaningful models.
I think we have all too arrogantly occupied the floor without giving any chance for the audience.
Can I just very briefly say two things? First is that there's also a difference between prediction and post-diction. When I'm saying prediction, I mean the future. Predict means to say something before it actually happens. What economists, including you, mean is post-diction. That you mean implications of theory against the data that are traces of the past happenings, past events.
Okay, but if you think about the future, I'm sure that I can come up with a model for any future.
Yeah, sure, but I mean none of them.
So, which is an economics model.
But the second thing is that I'm also not against modeling. I mean, I have a totally different take on modeling. I talk about iconic models, and for me, I mean, I don't start from a kind of a secure set of starting points and then deduce everything else from that. Rather, I start from a wide variety of interesting hypotheses drawn from different traditions when trying to explain something concrete in the geohistorical world. And then I contract the range of explanatory possibilities in terms of particular notion of causation and evidence that I have, including empirical evidence. And then the final outcome is that the model with which I explain in causal terms the thing that I want to explain.
Okay, we have two comments from the audience, Catherine and then Louis.
Well, thanks a lot for this debate. It's very interesting. And well, in some way, I have a question for both of you, and it follows up on Oskari's comments. And at a very abstract level, in both cases, what was striking to me is that there was very little of empirical in both your talks, and it seems that most of the debate was about methodological commitment or ontological assumptions, but science should be empirical a bit more in both cases. And okay, more specifically, I have a question to Patomäki, sorry, and one is like, you're claiming that the economists are positivists, but then you say that their practice is inconsistent from positivism, so I wonder where you get the impression that they are positivists, if their practice is not positivist. And the question to Hannu instead is that it also follows a bit from Oskari, but if assumptions may not be true, predictions may not be correct, all rationality, equilibrium, individualism, methodological commitments with no empirical merit whatsoever, it's totally unimportant whether they do have any empirical merits. And the only criteria is whether models work to understand we don't know what, because not definitely reality. Then I wonder what is it, what are these, even from a theorist viewpoint, what is theory of? Must be something up that really ties it with reality, and that's it.
Should I start?
Sure.
I think I'm in disagreement with Uskali in terms of whether mainstream neoclassical economics is positivist or not. I can't see any single feature that wouldn't be positivist. I mean, deductivism, closed system modeling, the overvaluation of mathematics, impossibility of thinking about any sort of alternative ways of logical inferences, including, for instance, practical inconsistencies or commitments and so on and so forth. I mean, it's all positivist. I mean, there are, of course, variations in terms of what kind of positive, including also the idea that all the concepts should be operationalized, and they always, there's kind of a convention between empirical realities and the models. But some forms might come close to what critical realists call realist empiricism or empiricist realism. That you claim to be talking about the world, but you still convey ontology and epistemology. You can't distinguish between the two, which I think is a presupposition for any rational sciences, that we can distinguish between the world we are talking about and our interpretations and understanding of that world. Otherwise, you can't make any criticism, you can't falsify anything, you can't make any sort of revisions about your own understanding unless you can somehow compare the two. Of course, there's no direct way of comparing the two. You have to use indirect ways, including evidence from a wide variety of different sources. But nonetheless, that distinction is extremely important. So I don't think that there's nothing that would distinguish between the practices of economists and positivism. They go hand in hand.
Yeah, about, okay, I emphasized that the model should work. I didn't specify, that's a good question. What I mean by that is that it should work, well, for me, it should work in the intuitive sense, but of course the intuition is developed through data. That's how your intuition develops you, or in the interplay between data and the models, different models that you gather. But the data does have an important role there. And actually, well, of course, when you start with, so when you say that the model should work, I mean, it's not in the sense that it should, well, falsifiability, in my opinion, is actually, I don't understand it in the context of social science. If you have not falsified a model, it just means that you didn't have the right data. Once you get the right data, and you will get, if you try to find hard enough, you will falsify it. There is no model that it will not become falsified at some point. That's for sure.
Not in neoclassical economics, but there are other modes of explanation that might prove the test better. I mean, that's exactly the problem. You don't want to falsify anything because that would falsify everything, all your theories.
But it would falsify also everyone else's theory. That's my point. There is no theory that wouldn't fall. I mean, it's not about economics. It's give me a theory and I will falsify it. I guarantee it.
I think there are, of course, I mean, all our explanations are always temporal and falsifiable and divisible. That doesn't mean, I think there are many good explanations provided by social sciences. I can see very few in neoclassical economics.
So, just 2 points. First, following a bit with what Katarina says, I wonder, just in general, what an applied economist, for example, a empirical labor economist or somebody working on health economics, environmental economics would, I mean, I wonder if they would recognize any of the criticisms as goals that they have, like, I don't think they're looking for universal laws, for example, at all. And on the other hand, I wonder if they would defend economics in the same terms as theoretical, because it's kind of completely not, I mean, I just think that an applied economist would be missing here. But a concrete question I have, as the second point, is to Professor Vartiainen. You have this idea of theoretical, you said you're a theoretical economist, not an empirical economist. And then you say that the use of formal and mathematical models is tautological in the formal sense, but educational in the humanistic sense. And I really wonder, what do you mean by educational in the humanistic sense? I mean, what is exactly what we learn? I mean, it's tautological, which really sounds like useless, and then you say that it's educational in some humanistic sense, so it's teaching me something ethical.
Okay, no, okay. Let me give you an example. Suppose that you have two traders, buyer and seller. The buyer can have value an object with a 0-1 interval. Suppose that the seller has the same thing. Here is seller, here is buyer. 0-1 interval. Now, possible combinations of these two valuations are somewhere in here, in this box. The buyer has higher valuation when they are in this area, right? Okay, so suppose that the buyer doesn't know the seller's valuation and the seller doesn't know the buyer's valuation. Is there a way that these two guys could trade the good, being rational, whenever they happen to have valuations precisely in this area? Okay, this is a question. I'm not expecting you to answer it, but I'm just saying that we can compute, we can prove a theorem which says that no, it's not possible. It's not possible ever using any bargaining mechanism that they could trade in here. So this is a result. It's a surprising result. It's a tautology because it's a theorem which is based on the assumptions. It's a tautology in that sense. But nevertheless, understanding how it works, where does the result come from, is very educated.
But educated to the agents in the market or to the economists?
No, to the economist, not to these guys. I don't know them. So, but to you as a theorist, when you prove it, you realize that, oh gee, hang on, this is the way it goes. Now I understand. Efficiency is impossible. Now I understand. That's the sort of a revelation that we are expecting to have. It's a tautology in the formal sense, but it's still very educated to understand where the result comes from. That's why we do this.
Unfortunately, it's not falsifiable, nor is the efficiency defined in any sense that would make us understand the world better. I mean, Pareto optimality, for instance, is not any universal definition of efficiency. It's a particular way of thinking about. First of all, you have to presuppose that actors have preferences exactly in the sense of neoclassical economics, and then you say that it's a situation where nobody's situation can be improved without worsening somebody else's situation. That's Pareto optimality. It's nothing like the universal definition of efficiency. First of all, usually dynamic efficiency is much more important than this kind of static efficiency. Secondly, it's based on untenable ontological assumptions. There are no preferences like that. Thirdly, it's a particular normative vision about society where, for instance, no redistribution is allowed for between different actors or social classes. And so it's a particular ideological stand. It has nothing to do with efficiency in any more generic sense of the term.
May I? So actually, it has a lot to do with I mean, you can obviously extend the notion of Pareto optimality to dynamic setting without any problem. The concept, the idea behind Pareto optimality survives without any complication. And of course, that's just a necessary condition for any good outcome. It's not a sufficient condition. You may have additional criteria like equity or something like that. It's starting.
It's a particular theory of justice based on the liberal no-harm principle and nothing else, and it's totally opposed to many other theories of justice, including, for instance, John Rawls's theory of justice.
But John Rawls's theory of justice is a special case of what it's Pareto optimal outcome, what you get out from there. So, as I said, it's a necessary condition, not a sufficient one.
It's neither necessary nor sufficient.
Okay, let me come back to the title of this conversation, namely, is economic, what was it? Self-contained and arrogant. Why is it so self-contained or arrogant to so many? A mere misunderstanding. Now we need to draw a distinction between the image and reality. I mean, I think it's uncontroversial that there is this image in place that economics indeed is self-contained and arrogant. We can't dispute that. I think you even don't dispute that. And we have witnessed it here, right here today. There is the image in place. But whether this image is accurate of some real properties of the discipline of economics is another question. Whether you guys are self-contained and arrogant and all that. And I think we are somehow undecided still about that. But I would say that without having discussions like this and without going on having discussions like this, trying to remove some of the misunderstandings and maybe changing the discipline itself in whatever way, the image will stick. It will be there forever. So let's go on and let's take this just as a first step towards reducing the at least the image of self-containment and arrogance of the discipline. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for the
Joo, kiitos.